Today, we are diving deep into some of the most, let's say, detailed laws you'll find in the ancient world, all coming from the book of Leviticus. We're going to unpack these rules about purity, disease, and cleansing. And trust me, it paints a much bigger picture about life and faith than you might think. Hey everyone, welcome. So yeah, like I said, today we are getting right into those complex and honestly pretty fascinating laws of purity found in Leviticus, specifically chapters 14 and 15. So here's the game plan. First, we're going to ask, what's the whole point of these ancient purity laws anyway? Then we'll look at how they actually cleansed people and even their houses. Yeah, that was the thing. We'll also get into the rules around bodily discharges, and then, this is the really cool part, we'll see how this whole system points to a totally new way of thinking about purity. All right, let's jump in. First up, we're looking at the big picture, these ancient laws of purity. And the key here isn't just to list the rules, right? We want to get to the why. What was really going on behind them? You know, if you've ever tried to read Leviticus, it can feel a little overwhelming, right? All these super specific regulations. But what was the point of it all? Well, it really boils down to two big reasons. First, there was a huge religious purpose. This was all about defining what it meant to be holy, to be set apart for God. And it's so important to get this. It wasn't about being sinful, but about being ritually clean or unclean. Basically, were you in a state to approach a holy God or not? And then there's the second reason, which is actually super practical. It was basically ancient public health. Okay, so that's the why. But how did this stuff actually work in real life? Let's take a look at a really powerful example. This super detailed two-stage ritual for cleansing someone who had recovered from a serious skin disease, something like leprosy. So the whole process was incredibly specific, and it happened in two main parts. First, everything started outside the community camp. The priest would come out, perform these initial rituals, and officially declare the person clean. But that was just step one. Think of it as being medically cleared. Step two was all about being welcomed back into the community. For that, you had to go to the tabernacle, the heart of their worship life, and present a whole series of offerings to be fully restored. And get this. The items they used in that first ritual, they were just packed with symbolism. I mean, nothing was random. You had one bird that was killed, representing the payment, the atonement for the disease. But then a second bird was set free, and you can just imagine what that symbolized. Freedom, a return to life. Then you have cedarwood, which stood for life's power over decay and death. Scarlet yarn, with all about that restored color, that vigor of life coming back. And hyssop? That was for relief from the awful smell and pain of the disease. And the final part of this cleansing was so personal, so symbolic. After all the offerings, the priest would apply blood and oil to three very specific parts of the person's body, basically rededicating their whole life. It was the right earlobe, so they could once again hear God's word, the right thumb, so they could do God's work with their hands, and the right big toe, so they could walk in God's ways. It's like their entire being was being welcomed back and set apart for a new start. So that's how it worked for a person. But believe it or not, these laws didn't stop there. They actually extended to people's homes. Which brings us to our next section, purifying a contaminated house. And yeah, we're talking about what happened when a condition they called leprosy, which was probably some kind of aggressive mold or fungus, started growing in your house. And what's wild is that the process for cleaning a house was almost a mirror image of cleaning a person. The priest comes in, inspects the place, and if it looks bad, he quarantines the whole house for a week. If the mold or whatever it was spreads, they would literally tear out the contaminated stones and replace them. And here's the kicker. They'd perform a purification ritual that was nearly identical to the one for a person, right down to using two birds and setting one free to show the home was clean again. So you see, this whole elaborate process, it was way more than just ancient mold removal. It was a really powerful symbol of freedom, of liberation, of salvation, and a complete new beginning for the home and the family living inside it. Okay, so we've talked about skin and we've talked about stone, things on the outside. Now we're going to shift gears to something way more personal, way more intimate. Let's get into the laws about dealing with bodily discharges. This is all about personal purity and holiness. So first things first, we got to be clear on what the text is even talking about here. When it mentions an unclean discharge, it's not talking about just normal everyday bodily functions. It's specifically referring to an abnormal, continuous flow, like blood or pus or semen, that was a sign of some kind of chronic illness or disease. And just like before, we see that same two-part reasoning pop up again. On the one hand, there was a religious purpose. These rules helped Israel live that holy, set-apart life. But on the other hand, there was a very practical hygienic purpose. I mean, in a time with limited medicine, washing and isolation were key tools to stop diseases from spreading through the community. Now, what's really interesting and maybe a little confusing for us today is that these laws also covered some completely natural bodily functions, like menstruation. The theological thinking here, according to the source, is that even these natural processes were seen as connected to the consequences of what they called a fallen human condition, a world that was no longer in its original perfect state. And for someone with a chronic condition, like a continuous hemorrhage, things were incredibly serious. It was seen as a disease of death and curse, and the impact on their life was just profound. It meant total social and religious isolation. Think about it. Anyone or anything they touched was also considered unclean. It was a devastating way to live. And that idea, that state of complete isolation, brings us perfectly to our final section, because this is where we see a really dramatic turning point in the whole story. We're going to look at a new path to purity and a huge shift from ritual to faith. So let's just pause and look at this contrast, because it is huge. In the Old Testament system we've been talking about, uncleanness is contagious, right? If you touch something unclean, you become unclean. It spreads. It requires all these rituals and offerings to fix. But in the New Testament healing we're about to see, the whole thing gets flipped on its head. Now, contact with holiness brings healing. The purity is what's contagious. And there's no better story to illustrate this than one from the New Testament. It's about a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhage for 12 years. 12 years of being unclean, of being isolated. And in this incredible act of desperation and faith, she thinks to herself, if I can just touch the edge of Jesus' garment, I know I'll be healed. So she fights her way through the crowd, she reaches out, she touches his cloak, and instantly she's healed. And Jesus stops, turns around, and says these words that signal this massive shift. He tells her, your faith has healed you. It wasn't a priest, it wasn't a ritual, it wasn't an offering. It was her faith. So these ancient laws from Leviticus, with all their details and rituals, they're really part of a much bigger story, aren't they? They show this incredible journey from external rules to internal faith, from separation to wholeness. And that kind of leaves us with a question to think about for our own lives. What are the modern rituals, the things we do that reveal our own deep beliefs about what it really means to be pure, to be clean, and to be healed?